Now I want to bring in Democratic Congressman David Cicilline of Rhode Island. He is a member of the Judiciary and Foreign Affairs Committees. Let's also talk about Mr. Grenell. Even if he's only there for a few weeks, as we just heard Aaron Banco say that he says he plans to be there, in your mind, is it risky to have somebody with that little experience and, as Ms. Banco reported, that little amount of respect afforded to him in the country where he's already ambassador and holding both jobs at the same time? What are the risks of that from your point of view?
Well, there are tremendous risks. I mean, this is an important position. We rely on the Director of National Intelligence to provide information to the Congress and to the President about the security threats to our country and have the chief responsibility of sharing that information with Congress in a bipartisan way. Richard Grenell is basically an internet troll. He is a loyalist to the President. He is not qualified to hold this position even for a single day. And now we're learning that Mr. Maguire was removed from the position, likely in part in response to the briefing he provided to the Intelligence Committee, and the President is installed on a temporary basis someone that's loyal to him. We need someone in that position that's loyal to our country and that's loyal to the responsibilities of the Director of National Intelligence, not someone who's going to be a sycophant to the President and be afraid to tell him what the intelligence has actually found. We have the most respected intelligence community in the world, the best men and women who are working incredibly hard to keep us safe and to give accurate information about the threats. And we need someone in that position who's willing to stand up to the President and share information, whether the President likes to hear it or not. So I think it's very, very alarming that Richard Grenell will be in this position, even in an acting position, for a short period of time.
You know, there's a sense in which Donald Trump is is trying to break all of these institutional forces in Washington, that he wants really to just answer to him and be loyal to him and for that to be their principal duty. Are you concerned that Republicans do not have a resistance to that and that they don't seem to be showing much of a resistance to the idea of a foreign country, a foreign adversary, maybe helping keep Donald Trump in power?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, I would hope that every single American believes that the American people get to decide who will be our president. The citizens of this great country have that important responsibility, and no foreign power has a right to interfere in that in any way. And when this first happened in 2016 and there was a systematic and sweeping interference by the Russians, what a president should have done is said, this will never happen again in the United States of America, and put together an interagency effort to make sure that we made it clear that the Russians would pay a price for that interference and that we had taken every step possible to prevent them from ever doing it again. Instead, what the President did from the very moment this was revealed is he diminished it. He called it a hoax. He prevented his members of administration from participating in the investigation of it. He undermined and attacked the intelligence community. He sided with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki. He repeated the Russian propaganda that it was really Ukraine. So the message to the world has been the President of the United States will not take these threats seriously. And it's the responsibility of the Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, to stand up as Americans and say, we will not allow any foreign power to meddle or interfere or undermine our elections. You know, we fight for free and fair elections around the globe and we promote democracy. This is about protecting free and fair elections in our own country so the American people ultimately get to decide who their leader is, not some foreign power. And I'm very concerned that my Republican colleagues failed to hold the President accountable for his inviting the Ukrainians to involve themselves and cheat in the 2020 election. And now it appears, if this reporting is true, that he became enraged when he learned that the intelligence community shared with the members of Congress the current state of affairs. This is very disturbing.
You did answer the question I was going to ask you. Congressman David Cicilline, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time tonight.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.